This is episode 19, Europe and the World, 1650 to 1800, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back to the Once and Future Present. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we are jumping into a really interesting topic, how Europe expanded between 1650 and 1800. There are some big shifts here, not just in farming and population, but also in industry, trade, and the economy. Joining me as always are our two brilliant co-hosts, Der Morgan.
Thanks, Casey. This is a rich and complex period. As we unpack these changes, we'll see how agricultural innovation, economic theory, and colonial expansion all reinforced each other and laid the groundwork for the modern global system.
And Professor Theo, I'm guessing this is one of those episodes where we see lots of interconnected threads.
Exactly, Casey. The rise in productivity and population, the displacement of workers, the growth of rural industry, the power of Atlantic trade, everything connects. And we'll also talk about how ordinary people adapted, resisted, and shaped this new world.
Let's get started. My first question is, why did European agriculture grow between 1650 and 1800? What changed?
Great place to start. At the beginning of that period, most Europeans were still working in agriculture. In fact, around 80% of people in places like France, Germany, and Italy were farmers. But farming was inefficient. One big problem was the open field system, where land was divided into long strips that everyone in the village farmed in the same way. That led to overused soil and low productivity.
What do you mean by open field system? Like, there were no fences or something?
Exactly. The land was not enclosed. Everyone followed traditional patterns, and decisions about what to plant and when to harvest were made communally. It had benefits like shared resources, but also a lot of limitations.
But it also had strengths. The open field system supported a very community-oriented way of life. The commons, shared lands outside the main fields, were crucial for poor villagers. People grazed animals there, gathered firewood, and foraged for food. It wasn't just about farming, it was about survival.
And don't forget the practice of gleaning. After the main harvest, poor women were allowed to walk through the fields and pick up leftover grain that had fallen. It was a customary right and part of a broader web of mutual obligations.
So these commons and traditions were like a safety net?
Exactly, which is why the enclosure movement caused so much anger. When nobles and wealthy landowners began fencing off common lands, it wasn't just about new farming techniques. It was about taking away those safety nets. People lost access to essential resources and, in many cases, their ability to survive.
In fact, the loss of commons was one of the motivations behind the German peasants' revolt back in the 1520s. That revolt may have been earlier than our main period today, but the frustrations endured. When peasants protested in the 18th century, one of their loudest complaints was the loss of customary rights.
An enclosure wasn't just economic. It represented a shift in power. Land that had once been managed with input from the whole village was now controlled by individuals or the state. It made agriculture more efficient, but also more unequal.
That makes it more clear why this was such a big deal. Okay, so if enclosure was controversial, were there places that resisted it?
Yes, especially in parts of France and Germany. In some regions, peasants managed to hold on to traditional practices well into the 19th century. It shows that these changes didn't happen all at once. They were uneven and contested.
And there were also more radical movements within England itself. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, a group called the Diggers tried to resist enclosure and promote a kind of early socialist vision. They believed land should be held in common and that all people should have the right to farm it.
The Diggers weren't alone. The Levelers were another group who pushed for broader democratic reforms, including more voting rights and equality before the law. Both groups challenged the idea that a small elite should control most of the land and wealth.
These ideas were seen as threatening by those in power. Oliver Cromwell, who led the parliamentary forces during the English Civil War, eventually crushed both the Diggers and the Levelers. Their vision of a more equal society was shut down by the same forces that would later support enclosure and capitalist development.
So, what were the new agricultural practices that replaced the old system?
One of the biggest breakthroughs was crop rotation. Instead of leaving a field fallow every other year, farmers began planting nutrient-restoring crops like clover, turnips, and legumes in between grain crops. This made the land more productive year after year.
And another major contribution came from the Americas. New World crops like the potato and maize were game changers. The potato in particular grew well in poor soil and had high caloric content, which meant it could support more people with less land.
The introduction of these crops wasn't just about the plants themselves. It came with new agricultural knowledge too. Native peoples in the Americas had been cultivating these crops for centuries, using techniques adapted to different soil types and climates. European farmers gradually incorporated some of those insights into their own systems.
So when we talk about Europe's agricultural revolution, we should recognize that it wasn't just homegrown innovation. It was also fueled by global exchange and the transfer of knowledge, often taken without acknowledgement from indigenous communities.
In addition to crops and rotation, there was also early mechanization. Jethro Tull's invention of the seed drill in the early 1700s allowed farmers to plant seeds in neat rows at the correct depth. That improved germination rates and reduced seed waste significantly.
Farmers also began using horses instead of slower oxen for plowing and transporting goods. This increased the speed and efficiency of their work. Selective breeding of livestock also improved yields of meat, milk, and wool.
And all of these changes were wrapped up in the broader movement for enclosure. The Enclosure Act of 1773 in Britain legally permitted landowners to fence in open fields and commons, often pushing poor farmers off land they had used for generations.
That contributed to the proletarianization of the rural population. Families who once had small plots or access to common land lost their independence and were forced to work as wage laborers. They became part of a growing rural working class with no land and few rights.
And it wasn't just the loss of land. The new laws required fencing in property, which many small farmers couldn't afford. Without enclosed fields, they couldn't legally continue farming, even if they still had access to part of the land.
At the same time, the cost of modern equipment like seed drills or strong draft horses was far out of reach for most peasant families. Wealthier landlords and commercial farmers could invest in mechanized tools, but smallholders were quickly left behind.
Those tools also reduced the need for hired labor. A machine that once required 10 people to do a job could now be operated by just 1 or 2. As a result, jobs in agriculture disappeared, and the rural poor were squeezed even further.
Food prices dropped too, because farms became more efficient and output increased. But that made it harder for small farmers to make a living. They couldn't sell their crops at a high enough price to keep up with wealthier competitors.
And it's important to note that the Enclosure Act of 1773 was passed by a British Parliament that was anything but democratic. Only a small fraction of the population, mostly the richest landowners, could vote. Those elites used their power to pass laws that benefited themselves and pushed smaller farmers out.
So, the very things that increased food production also displaced a lot of people.
Exactly. It was progress with consequences. The agricultural revolution set the stage for industrialization, but it also widened social and economic divisions.
Okay, so with more food and more efficient farming, did Europe start to see a bigger population?
It did. Population growth in the 18th century was dramatic. A big part of that was declining mortality rather than soaring birth rates.
Plague outbreaks disappeared after the early 1700s. The last major one was in Marseille in 1720. And even though medical knowledge was still limited, public health improved with better sewage systems and cleaner water in many towns.
Plus, the development of transportation networks like roads and canals made it easier to move food to areas hit by poor harvests. That helped prevent famines from becoming catastrophic.
And I imagine having more people means more workers too, right?
Exactly. That labor force helped drive the expansion of rural industry. Part of the reason rural industry expanded was because farming no longer required as many workers. With mechanization making farms more efficient and fewer jobs available in agriculture, displaced rural people needed new ways to support their families.
And don't forget the population boom. Even as fewer people were needed to work the land, more people were being born and surviving into adulthood. That surplus of labor found an outlet in home-based manufacturing, where even children could contribute to household income.
But with more workers available than there were jobs, wages began to decline. The surplus of labor meant that employers could pay less, knowing there were plenty of desperate people willing to take the work. This growing mismatch between population and resources caught the attention of thinkers like Thomas Malthus.
Malthus argued that population would always outstrip the food supply unless checked by famine, disease, or war. He believed that poverty was an unavoidable result of too many people and not enough resources, and he was deeply skeptical about the long-term benefits of economic or agricultural progress alone.
His ideas had a lasting influence. Many policymakers in the 19th century used Malthusian thinking to justify inaction on poverty. They argued that aid to the poor would only encourage population growth and make the problem worse. Instead of reform, they promoted harsh workhouses and limited charity.
And even today, echoes of Malthus's ideas show up in debates about welfare, environmental sustainability, and global development. While some of his predictions didn't come true, like the idea that food production couldn't keep pace, his warnings about resource scarcity continue to shape modern thinking.
So, how did people adapt when they couldn't survive just by farming anymore?
Before this shift, most manufacturing took place in cities and was controlled by guilds, associations of craftsmen who regulated quality, training, and prices. These guilds protected their members' interests, but made it hard for outsiders or rural people to get involved.
As population grew and agricultural laborers were displaced, more people began producing goods outside of the guild system. That system is sometimes called the putting out system. A merchant would supply a rural family with raw materials, like wool or flax, and the family would spin and weave it into cloth, which the merchant would then collect and sell.
So, kind of like mini factories at home?
Yes, but without the machinery. It relied on hand tools and human labor, and the whole family often participated. It gave people a way to earn income outside of farming.
But it wasn't always fair. Women were often paid far less than men, and the work could be grueling. Merchants sometimes accused rural workers of laziness if they didn't meet deadlines.
That brings us to the Industrious Revolution, right? What was that about?
The Industrious Revolution was a shift in how families used their time. They began working more, especially women and children, and focused on earning wages rather than just producing for their own needs.
That extra income let them buy more goods, especially consumer items like sugar, tea, and printed textiles. One of the most important sectors was the textile industry. Rural families, especially women and children, took on spinning and weaving as household labor. Girls were often responsible for spinning thread, while older women and men wove cloth. Even small children might help card wool or wind yarn.
This shift didn't just change how people worked, it changed family life and time use. The home became both a domestic and economic space, and the rhythms of daily life began to center more around income generation than subsistence. It was a foundational step toward a fully industrial economy.
And it wasn't just about household change. The rise of wage labor in the countryside helped fuel economic growth in cities as well. But this growth was uneven. Cities that were plugged into the Atlantic economy, especially port cities like Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, boomed thanks to trade in sugar, tobacco, cotton, and enslaved people. In contrast, towns not connected to global trade saw slower or more limited development.
And did this connect to changes in economic thinking?
Definitely. Enlightenment thinkers began to apply reason and natural law not only to politics and science, but also to economics. The most influential figure here was Adam Smith, whose 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, laid the foundation for what we now call economic liberalism.
Smith was deeply critical of the dominant economic system of the time, mercantilism. That system aimed to increase national wealth by restricting imports, promoting exports, and controlling colonial trade through monopolies and tariffs. Mercantilist policies often benefited the state and powerful merchants, but hurt ordinary consumers.
In contrast, Smith believed that free markets and open competition would lead to more innovation, better products, and lower prices. He argued that tariffs and trade restrictions distorted the natural flow of commerce and mainly served elite interests.
Smith wasn't against all government involvement. He believed the state had important roles to play: infrastructure, education, enforcing contracts, and preventing monopolies. But he insisted that any intervention should ultimately benefit consumers, not entrenched elites.
That's the invisible hand idea. Smith believed that individuals pursuing their own self-interest would unintentionally help society as a whole. But he was not naive. He warned that employers could conspire to keep wages low and that markets needed rules to function fairly.
The irony is that even as Smith's ideas gained popularity among intellectuals, most governments continued practicing mercantilism in reality. They talked about free trade, but kept using tariffs and granted exclusive trading rights as political favors. Many also continued expanding their empires to secure raw materials and markets, which ran directly counter to Smith's vision of voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange.
So while people were talking about free markets, they were still acting like empire builders?
Exactly. And that brings us to the next part of the story: how colonial markets and the Atlantic economy reshaped Europe's role in the world.
And this was happening while European powers were expanding their global trade networks. Colonial markets played a huge role in Europe's development.
Like sugar, tobacco, and cotton from the Americas?
Yes, and slaves from Africa. The Atlantic economy linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a brutal system of exploitation. Enslaved Africans were transported across the ocean to work on plantations.
That system brought enormous wealth to European merchants and governments. In Britain especially, the profits from slavery became deeply embedded in the national economy. Wealth generated by enslaved labor flowed into shipping, insurance, banking, and manufacturing. Cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London saw massive economic growth, much of it tied directly to the trade in enslaved people and the goods produced by their labor.
Plantations in the Caribbean and the American South produced sugar, cotton, and tobacco on a scale that would have been impossible without enslaved labor. These products were incredibly lucrative and in high demand across Europe. Investors, politicians, and business leaders all had financial stakes in maintaining and expanding the slave trade.
There were also communities of escaped slaves known as Maroons, especially in Jamaica. These groups resisted colonization by creating independent settlements in the mountains and forests. Through guerrilla warfare and strategic negotiations, they successfully defended their autonomy for decades. The Maroons even signed treaties with the British in the 18th century that recognized their freedom in exchange for peace, though these agreements were always precarious.
They are a powerful reminder that enslaved people didn't accept their fate passively. They fought for their freedom in every way they could. Their resistance undermined the idea that slavery was stable or uncontested.
But by the late 18th century, some people in Europe were beginning to question the morality of slavery. The abolitionist movement started gaining traction, especially in Britain. Religious groups like the Quakers were some of the earliest voices calling for the end of the slave trade.
One of the most powerful figures in this movement was Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man who purchased his freedom and wrote a best-selling autobiography. His vivid account of the horrors of slavery gave many Europeans their first direct look at the brutality of the trade.
Equiano and others used their voices to challenge the idea that slavery was necessary or acceptable. Their work laid the foundation for broader abolitionist efforts, even as the system of slavery continued to expand across the Atlantic world.
Well, that gives us a lot to think about. Thanks so much, Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo. That wraps up episode 19. And remember, if you liked this episode, be sure to follow us and check out our AP Euro and AP US albums, streaming now on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Until next time, stay curious, think critically,